Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you like this kind of story, please subscribe, tap the bell, and consider supporting the channel with a membership or super thanks. Snow battered the old farmhouse, carving cold lines across its windows. The night smelled of iron and silence until headlights sliced through the blizzard. One bike arrived, then another. 15 in all. Their engines a deep, rising drum outside Agnes Porter's porch. Agnes was 78, widowed, and lived alone in a weathered house on the edge of Montana. Her days were small and steady, feeding chickens, knitting beside the fire, writing letters she never sent. Money was scarce, but her life was full of memories, some tender, some hard. Winters here could cut the valley off for days, and Agnes had grown used to the hush. It reminded her of her late husband James and of a world that felt quieter with time. That night the hush broke. She had just finished her tea when a distant roar grew until it shook the floorboards. She peered through the curtain and saw headlights punching through the snow, rows of machines crawling up her long drive. Fear flickered across her face. 15 leather-clad riders stood in the wind, faces mostly hidden by scarves, patches on their jackets catching the porch light. One patch, bold and familiar, made her heart skip. The emblem people in town whispered about, the symbol of an outlaw motorcycle club. Her first impulses were survival, lock the door, hide, call for help. But phone service here was spotty at best. She remembered a winter long ago when a stranger had opened his home to her, and James when their truck broke down. James had always told her not to let fear run her life. With that memory, she unlatched the door. Snowstorm and wind burst in as 15 tall figures stepped across Agnes's threshold. The leader pulled down his scarf to reveal a weathered face and tired eyes. He introduced himself in a low voice. Jack. They were traveling west and had been trapped by the storm. They only needed shelter for a night. Agnes hesitated, then stepped aside. One by one they came in, stamping snow from boots that left dark wet marks across the wood floor. The living room, which usually held only the ticking of a clock, filled with the scent of leather and diesel and the sound of heavy breathing. Agnes busied herself grabbing blankets, setting out mismatched mugs and getting the kettle on. Her hands shook, but she kept moving. The bikers were awkward in the coziness of the farmhouse, hulking bodies hunched beneath low beams, big hands rubbing cold fingers. One young man, Luke, had tattoos climbing his neck and frost-bitten fingertips. Agnes wrapped a worn wool blanket around him without a second thought. For a moment the room softened. The label outlaw slipped away, and what remained was simply people, tired, hungry human. They offered to pay, food, warmth, anything, but Agnes refused. "You don't owe me," she said. "Just don't break anything." They laughed a little, the sound carrying an odd warmth. Over bowls of stew stretched with potatoes and beans, they told quiet stories. One adjusted a battered guitar and strummed, as if the chords could stitch up the cold. Jack, who had a tough exterior, spoke softly about his grandmother and the losses that shaped him. Agnes found in their voices a grief not so different from her own. As midnight deepened, the storm raged, but inside the farmhouse there was an unexpected ease. Some of the riders slept on rugs, jackets draped to dry. Others whispered in low tones. Agnes lay awake upstairs, listening to the shuffles below and thinking of James. Had she been foolish? Would kindness cost her dearly? At dawn she woke to the sound of engines starting. Panic rushed through her until she peered out and saw the riders preparing to leave. Jack saw her watching and lifted a hand in thanks. There were no promises, no grand speeches, only a carved, weathered gratitude. When they rode away, their taillights disappeared into the white. Agnes went into town that day for flour and kerosene, expecting the usual nods and small talk. Instead, the general store fell quiet as she entered. People whispered, "You let them inside." The club stayed at her place. The murmurs carried the weight of suspicion. Some called her reckless. An older neighbor, Ruth, stopped by that evening, chastising Agnes gently for inviting those men in. Agnes poured tea and said plainly she'd done what she thought was right. "They were freezing," she said. "They were men who needed a roof for the night." But the rumor mill had started spinning, and fear is contagious. The sheriff came by uneasy and respectful. He warned her quietly that those who wore that patch brought trouble. Agnes stood her ground. She had chosen compassion. The sheriff left with a worried look, but he didn't force the issue. That night, as she sat by the hearth, headlights flared again. Not 15 this time. 100 machines stretched down her lane, their beams cutting rows in the snow like an army of stars. Agnes stepped out in her robe, breath swirling, and watched as one figure after another dismounted in methodical silence. Jack walked forward and, with simple words, explained why they had returned, because she had given shelter when others would not. They had come to repay her with respect. The scene was startling and calm at once. The bikers moved with order, not menace. They set to work shoveling her path, stacking firewood on her porch, and repairing the sagging fence that had been falling for years. Rough hands, so often imagined as violent, worked gently repairing the house James had once built. They left tokens at her steps, bandanas, patches, gloves, small offerings heavy with meaning. Word spread through town quickly. Where people had expected a confrontation, they found instead a quiet display of care. Those who had once whispered about danger now watched as men who wore feared patches restored a neighbor's home. For Agnes, it was overwhelming. "You gave us warmth," Jack told her, "but you gave us something more. Dignity." He promised that if she ever needed them, she needed only to call. In the weeks after, life returned to its ordinary rhythm, feeding the chickens, knitting by the stove, writing letters she tucked away. But everything felt different. The mended fence and stacked wood were visible reminders. The neighbors who had once looked askance now spoke of that night in new tones. Some still suspicious, others moved. Agnes found herself seen, not as a frail widow, but as someone who had chosen compassion over fear, and the world had answered with engines and quiet loyalty. Her farmhouse, small and weathered, now carried a story, one that traveled farther than the snow. People still argued about what had happened, as they always do about things that unnerved them. But the men who had parked in her drive hadn't come to cause harm. They had come to be human, and in return they left her with kindness that reverberated long after the last bike had vanished down the road. Agnes kept to her routines, but sometimes she would stand on the porch and look at the horizon with a different kind of peace. She thought of James and whispered, "Silence isn't only about listening. Sometimes it's about letting us act." That night, when she opened her door, she had not only saved 15 men from the cold, she had reminded a small valley that compassion can change how people see one another. And in that exchange, a single, generous act multiplied, lighting 100 headlights in return. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and ring the bell.